The next section we discuss from Chapter 1 is Section 1.4, Growth and Inequality. While the level of inequality within most countries has increased over the past 2 decades, global inequalities between countries have declined. The gap between the average incomes of the richest 10% of countries and the average incomes of the poorest 50% of countries dropped from around 50-fold to little less than 40-fold. At the same time, inequalities increased significantly within countries. The gap between the average incomes of the top 10% and the bottom 50% individuals within countries has almost doubled from 8.5-fold to 15-fold. This sharp rise within country inequalities has meant that despite the economic catch-up and strong growth in emerging countries, the world remains particularly unequal today. Inequality has many relevant dimensions. One may care about how many people live in poverty. For example, how many people in a country live below an income of $2.15 a day, or what percentage of people in a country make up the middle class, or the income level of very rich people. For example, how much wealth in a country belongs to the top 1%. A complete picture would require a lot of graphs, but 2 figures have been presented in the textbook. Figures 1.7 and 1.8 in the book show 3 measures for the United States and France and capture some of these relevant dimensions, although not particularly what has happened at the very bottom of the income distribution. The author chose France as an alternative to the US because it is fairly representative of evolutions in continental Europe. Each figure shows the proportion of national income since 1960 that goes to the top 1% and top 10%. So the very rich and the rich, and then the bottom 50%. The figures have 2 main features. The first is that while inequality is higher in the US than in France, it is high in both countries. 2021 is the latest year for which data was available when this book was written. In general, today, data till 2022 is available. In 2021, the share of the top 1% was almost 10% in France and 20% in the United States. The share of the top 10% was 31% in France and 45% in the United States. The share of the bottom 50% was 23% in France and only 14% in the United States. The second feature is that while inequality has increased in the United States, meaning within the US, with shares of the top 1% and 10% going up, it has slightly decreased in France, with the 2 shares declining from 11% to 9% for the top 1% people and from 38% to 31% people for the top 10%. These conclusions must come with 2 remarks. First, these numbers show income inequality. Remember that there is a difference between wealth and income. Wealth is the accumulation of income over time. Wealth inequality is actually even larger. If you look at global wealth inequalities, they are even more pronounced than income inequalities. This graph has been sourced from the World Inequality Report in 2022. As you can see, the poorest half of the global population barely owns any wealth at all, possessing just 2% of the total. In contrast, the richest 10% of the global population owns 76% of all wealth. On average, the poorest half of the population owns $4,100 per adult, and the top 10% owns a little less than $800,000 per adult. Second, these numbers are based on pre-tax income. That is what people are paid before they pay taxes. In Europe in general, and in France in particular, progressive taxation and other fiscal measures reduce the level of inequality, sometimes very substantially. Numbers are more difficult to construct, but we know, for example, for France, the share of post-tax income going to the top 10% is 25% compared to the 31% pre-tax, and the share going to the bottom 50% is 32% compared to the 25% pre-tax. Redistribution is substantially smaller in the US. Both remarks point to the inequality in the United States that is suggested by figure 1.7. Interestingly, given these numbers, polls suggest that the French are more hostile to inequality than the Americans. These numbers raise fundamental questions. What is the relation between growth and inequality? Can growth in market economies benefit all, or does it naturally benefit some more than others? Does technological progress increase inequality? The answer is, it depends. Take, for example, the current discussions around AI. One can think of two extreme scenarios. One in which AI-based robots and programs eventually replace middle-skilled workers, leaving many of them unemployed or having to accept low-paying jobs. The other in which AI, robots, and programs allow low-skilled workers to do more complex tasks and get better jobs. The first leads to more inequality than the second one. But which one will prevail? Can the state, through some subsidy or any other means, affect the outcome by inducing firms to choose the second option rather than the first option? These are again very crucial macroeconomic issues. The outcome of these issues will determine the evolution of inequality globally. The last topic that this chapter discusses is in section 1.5, global warming. I'm more comfortable with using climate change, so I'll be using climate change. Climate change is no longer a hypothesis or a distant threat. There's overwhelming evidence that it is happening now. Figure 1.9 shows the evolution of world temperatures since 1880 as a deviation from the mean temperature from 1951 to 1980. The increase since the mid-1960s is about 1 degree Celsius, which is striking. Forecasts say that if nothing is done, temperature may increase by another 3 degrees by the end of the century. The consequences would be catastrophic. A large part of the African continent would become uninhabitable due to high temperatures and drought. Sea level would increase between 6 and 12 feet, largely covering low-lying areas such as Indonesia and my country, Bangladesh. The better news is that governments have started to act. Countries have agreed on a goal to limit the increase in world temperatures relative to its pre-industrial level to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This requires a dramatic decrease in new emissions. A number of countries, including the United States, have set a target of zero emissions by mid-century. But it is not clear whether the fight against climate change will be won. There are two separate issues here. The first is if the fight is technically winnable, whether production can be changed in a timely way to reduce and eventually eliminate emissions. The answer is probably yes. Technological progress in green energy has become extremely fast. The cost of producing a watt using solar panels, for example, has fallen from $100 in 1975 to $5 in the year 2000 to 25 cents in 2021. And governments have a box of policy tools to accelerate this process, ranging from subsidies for research and development of green technologies to introducing a carbon tax to increase the cost of using technologies that produce high emissions, to providing subsidies for firms that reduce emissions. Now the question is, can we have positive economic growth while maintaining a zero emissions policy? The answer again is probably yes, but how realistic is it? Advanced economies have been able to reduce emissions substantially while continuing to grow. Both the United States and Europe have reduced emissions by 25% since the year 2000 while maintaining economic growth. However, the shift to new and less proven technologies may imply lower growth for some time. And even if output continues to grow, the higher investment required may reduce what is left for consumption. Fighting climate change has a cost, but the alternative for the future is even worse. The second issue is whether there is political will to do it. Efforts to combat climate change will be expensive, and so far, for several reasons, it is not clear whether many governments will do what is needed. Faced with the need to spend more, governments can finance efforts either through increase in taxes or through debt. Voters may be unwilling to accept an increase in taxes, but at the same time, as I discussed earlier in this chapter, too large a further decrease in debt may be dangerous. Faced with the fact that their own country's actions may have a negligible effect on world emissions, many governments may be tempted to do little themselves and hope to benefit from the actions of others. So far, governments have made promises, but not commitments. Finally, there is a fundamental geopolitical issue at work. Rich countries, which industrialized earlier, are responsible for most of the cumulative emissions so far. Should they not help poorer countries, which have not yet industrialized as much, bear the cost of fighting climate change? Remember the question: can we have positive growth while maintaining zero emissions policy? Clearly, poor countries cannot. If the rich countries do not help, can poor countries, many of them already with very large debt burdens, afford the cost? Is it unfair to ask poor countries to bear the cost while they have not been responsible for a majority of the past emissions? These are crucial macroeconomic issues and questions. How and whether they are going to be solved will determine the future of our economies and our planet.